Thank you so much for that introduction. And it's my pleasure and honor to be here with all of you today and have a chance to speak to you about my research. I love this idea, by the way. If I could only pay my students to ask good questions. So I love that incentive structure that you've set up here. I'm going to talk to you about some of my research, and I love the comments you heard from Dr. Subramaniam. So I'm going to try to segue in from what he was talking about. And just in full disclosure, I've of course been to FMS many times. I went to St. Stephen's, so I'm very familiar with your campus, and I'm delighted to be doing this. So let me get started. Let's start 12 months before. Life was already pretty tough in terms of what we think about is happening in business. If you look at what are kind of the salient trends we were talking about, there were several things going on in markets. Excuse me, 1 second. It seems that you are not able to see my PowerPoints. Just give me 1 second. Let's try that again. Okay. I hope that's better. There we go. Okay. So what we discovered, even if you look back a year ago, what you saw was customers over the last decade have unprecedented access to choices that we could never imagine. In India, for instance, you can think about the access to automobiles, to banking services, to products, and we had unprecedented access to information. We could choose, we had social media, we could look at reviews, and this creates what economists call growing transparency in markets. And transparency is great for the customer, but it makes life very hard for the seller because now you are facing what people call commoditization pressures. You start to look like everybody else. So the whole dilemma was, how do I command premium in markets that are saturating, getting commoditized? This is happening not only in B2C markets, but also B2B markets. So you start to see all that was already brewing. And Fortune magazine had called it commodity hell. That how do we compete? And it's okay for low cost providers, but if you're a premium provider, you're constantly facing pressure from the low cost players and they start moving up. That's what Hyundai did to all the Japanese car companies. That's what Samsung did to Sony. So you see these players moving up, and then the Chinese came after them, trying to move their way up as well. So you start to see tremendous pressure building in these markets. Now you add to that what's happened just in the last 12 to 18 months. As you heard already, and I don't need to tell you about this, we also have, let's not forget, we have a climate crisis. People don't talk about it. We have a climate crisis. Somehow it's gone into the background, but with the Biden administration, it is going to be back in the foreground, right? People don't talk about economic headwinds, that, we do have a slowdown. We do have demand stagnation. And then you have something that has accelerated in the last 12 months. In some ways, one of the kind of the positive silver lining in this whole disaster has been acceleration of digitization. You have things that companies are doing that they were talking about doing, but slowly doing it, inching their way there. You have in medicine, telemedicine, which people have talked about for a decade, suddenly accelerating. You see curbside pickups happening in Starbucks, which they never thought they would be doing. And you have competitive disruptions. So what you start to see for the multinationals, at least, is the rise of the local competitor. And you start to see local competition in many markets, giving them a real run for their money. And so you start, this is happening globally, by the way. And you have social upheaval. Now, this is a real issue in the United States. It's long overdue, but we also know that income inequality has grown dramatically. And if you believe Thomas Piketty and others, you know that this, at some point, you reach a kind of a tipping point in society. And that hasn't gone away. So if anything, you see in COVID that the outcomes have been so different that it makes it even worse. So we have an unprecedented moment. Now, when we teach leadership, we always have a kind of an easy buzzword. We say, oh, yeah. Here's the word for you, agility or whatever it is. And our buzzword has been resilience. So let me say a little bit about what I'm talking about here. I wanted to go back and share some research I did about a decade ago, in which I looked at how companies respond to crises. And I got data. I'm sorry, this is US data. But I got data for 3 recessions and I looked at all public companies, the entire population. And my co-authors and I found, first of all, 17% of companies do not survive a recession, right? And 80% of survivors had not regained their pre-crisis growth rate 3 years after. So the recovery is slow. I know we're talking about bounce backs, and we're going to have the roaring 20s again, but at least history, if you believe history, suggests it's not so straightforward. 40% of us had not regained their pre-crisis levels 3 years after. So I told you the mantra we like to say is resilient leadership. Now, we don't like to define some of our constructs sometimes. So this poses the question of how do you define resilience? What does it mean to be resilient? Now, if you look at the conventional definition we give of resilience, it's very typically around adapting to adversity. How do you adapt to adversity? And it's a great definition, and I think it's absolutely important. How do you adapt to adverse circumstances? But I think it's a highly incomplete definition because it has a very defensive stance. It's about how are you going to cope with a difficult situation? It's a coping story. The other half of it is how are you going to grow from it? How are you going to use adversity to get ahead? How are you going to learn from adversity? Adversity is always also a teacher, right? And I don't need to recite the Bhagavad Gita to you, but you can understand that adversity is a teacher. Now, what does that mean for businesses? In this same study, I found that 9% of survivors came out stronger from the crisis. So there was a subset of companies that actually used the crisis to get ahead in terms of sales, in terms of profitability, in terms of growth trajectories, in terms of market presence and market share. On all the parameters, you see them coming out stronger. So this, for my co-authors and I, posed the question of never waste a good crisis. Never waste a good crisis because it illuminates opportunities and it allows you to hit the reset button in your organization. But most of us think of crisis as, oh my God, hunker down. This too shall pass. Right? So I recently, for my research, I interviewed Kevin Johnson, who's the CEO of Starbucks, and he said, if we're not changed when we come out of this, we've missed an opportunity. So how do companies turn adversity into opportunity? How do they see, okay, what opportunities are being presented to us? And many opportunities emerge in crises. And it's not just the obvious, let's sell face masks or let's sell hand sanitizers. I'm not talking about those. There are fundamental shifts happening in markets that you have to catch on to. What are those shifts? And again, I'm not even going to the obvious, like, oh, I'm going to sell a Peloton bike because everybody wants to exercise at home. So I'm going to sell them a home bike, or you have to look really hard to discover those opportunity spaces. How is buying behavior changing, right? How are technologies going to enable things to be done differently? And the challenge, other thing also is that adversity reveals and accelerates hidden weaknesses in incumbent firms. So you have incumbents who are unable to respond. I wrote a case last year on Netflix. And to me, the fascination of Netflix to me was that this is a company that had reinvented itself multiple times, right? Even the name they had for themselves was Netflix, not DVD by mail, which is what they were doing early on, right? Their whole story was really one of, we were going to, one day we're going to, and so they start shipping us DVDs. They regulate consumption by saying you'll only get one DVD at a time. They locate their distribution warehouses next to postal distribution centers so they don't have to pay extra for overnight delivery. They optimize their inventory around the country and they kill the giant in the industry. They were a startup. So here you have a startup organization that destroys a 7,000 store juggernaut, Blockbuster. And when I was interviewing them, one of them gentlemen said to me, he says, Professor, I think you're studying the wrong company. You shouldn't be writing a case on us. So I said, why? He said, the really interesting company to study is Blockbuster. How did he says, everyone tells us that we killed Blockbuster. We didn't kill Blockbuster. He said, we in fact went to Blockbuster and said, would you like to buy us? And he said, Blockbuster missed the idea that one of the key elements of their value proposition was late fees. They gave you the DVD for 4 or 5 days, and then they hit you with late fees, knowing fully well that customers usually show up once a week. So they had juiced up their earnings by saying, oh, you can get a DVD for $3.99, but actually you're going to pay $8.99 or $5.99 because you're going to have late fees. And they made $600 million a year in late fees. Customers hated late fees. So it's a very simple idea. No late fees. We'll have a subscription model and we'll regulate consumption. So you see, it's not technology even. So this gentleman says to me, he says, in business schools, you guys are always talking about homicide, who killed whom. He said, no, the devil is inside, not outside the organization. We like to blame the market. We like to say, oh my God, the market is this and the market is that. And the market forces are changing and technology is coming and regulation is coming and competition is coming. Or we talk about maturing markets. So the devil is really inside. It's really us, our own inability. And now this is not, and the question then you ask is, why do companies have suicidal tendencies? What is wrong with them? What is the role of the leaders and the boards and everybody else in the organization? There's a collective complicity in this story. In fact, this is not my idea. Peter Drucker, the late management thinker, said the greatest danger is not the turbulence, but to act with yesterday's logic. Somehow we get locked in. We get locked into a certain way of thinking, a certain way of doing things, and we're unable to reimagine. That's why sometimes it takes a startup or an outsider to come and say, well, again, look at this example. It was not rocket science. We're going to mail you a DVD and not charge late fees and charge you $9.99 a month. So predictable expenses, outlays, and you'll only get one DVD at a time. If you want two at a time, we'll charge you $30.99 a month. So we'll regulate consumption. If you want three at a time, we'll charge you a bit more. This was not rocket science. Now, it is interesting, when they went to Blockbuster, Blockbuster said, buy what? There's nothing here to buy. So, you understand what happens in organizations. So I've been trying to unpack what goes wrong and what are the opportunities for us to be thinking about. And there are really three sources of inertia: strategic, organizational, and cultural inertia that kick into organizations. And I'll just dwell on a couple of them. The first one is strategic inertia. Now, from all your strategy courses, you must have learned strategy is all about focus. We talk about where do you want to play, where do you not want to play? What do you want to do? What do you not want to do? It's all about knowing where you're going to win and how you're going to win. So it's really about competitive advantage, but it's all around focus. And that is great. So you define a vision and you define focus, and that's what you're going to do. But at the same time, it can make us myopic. That same focus that gives us success can make us miss opportunities. You can think of pedestrian examples of this, right? Everyone has a suitcase with wheels that we take on an airplane. Well, guess what? None of the luggage companies came up with that idea. Now you ask yourself, really? What were they doing? And these are big companies, you know them. So you can see countless examples where there's an idea right under the nose, and somehow people don't catch it. I'm looking at a company right now in the US. It's called Livongo. That is an app for chronically ill people who have diabetes or hypertension. And it's just a self-monitoring app. But you ask yourself, why did nobody else do it? Why did it take a startup to say, you know what? Chronically ill people need constant monitoring. And if we can give them a device that allows them to do that and be in touch with their physician if they have to. Wow. So I have come to realize that we get kind of this locked and loaded. So I'll give you a personal example. So you are in Delhi. I wanted to show you a picture of my favorite place in Delhi, right? Is Lodi Garden. And I've been going there since I was a kid. So whenever I go to Delhi, I always go there in the morning and I go for a nice long walk. I'll do 3 rounds and I'll come back. And as you know, those Christmas tree-like structures in front of you is a walkway. It's about 10, 12 feet wide. And I always go in there, and this is the entrance, and I don't know, I'm right-handed, I always go right. So the last time I was there a year and a half ago, I got in there, I'm going to take a right turn. And sometimes you have large groups of friends who are walking together and talking. So as I'm turning right, there's a large cluster of people walking very slowly together. I don't know what I said. You know what? I don't want to go around them. It looks awkward. I don't want to be pushy. I'll just take a left. So for the first time in my life that I can remember, I did the same circle, but I took the left. I thought I was in a different garden. I had a completely different perspective and a vantage point into the same place that I've gone to for so long. And I think strategy does the same thing to us. We kind of lock and load. And what happens is we get tunnel vision. We see existing customers, existing markets, existing products, existing capabilities, and these lock us in, as opposed to looking at the space differently, saying, what's possible? Why have we done it this way? What other possibilities exist? Can we try this? Can we try that? You see so many companies trying subscription models around all kinds of things that people hadn't considered before. And again, technology is one enabler. You can rely on digitization and look at it that way. Somebody had to think about home delivery of groceries and home delivery of restaurant food. There's so many other things, whether you go back to Amazon even. So, or you look at Tony Hsieh, the founder of Zappos, who passed away recently. What was his idea? Home shopping for shoes. People said it was impossible. Well, he built a company to show that it was possible. So you start to see, Warby Parker sells eyeglasses online. Said it was impossible. Well, they made it possible. So you start to see how we're going to get locked in. So that's strategic inertia. But that's not the biggest one. What I found interesting in the companies that I've seen that have failed, iconic companies, big companies that were great companies here, long time, Kodak, Polaroid, you can look at Nokia, you can look at Sears. What you discover is they have the ideas. They know what to do even. They got the smartest people working for them. They're all locked and loaded. They talk about it, and then they fall into what I call, not my term, I'm sorry, two of my colleagues here at the School of Education call the knowing doing gap. The knowing doing gap is you know what to do, you know how to do it, but you don't do it. And this pathology actually kicks in for individuals as it does for organizations. So, for instance, we are now at the end of the year. On New Year's Day, number one resolution people make around the world is I'm going to exercise, lose weight. We all make resolution. We all join a gym. We all try in January. We are kind of at it. And then by February, the whole thing collapses. It's a classic example of knowing doing gap. The same thing happens in companies. Kodak talked about digitization. We're going to be a digital company. We're going to get rid of film. We're going to do something else. We're going to have digital cameras. We're going to go into printers. They talked about it. They even began working on it, and then it fizzled out. Then they would jumpstart again the following year and again. And what happens? You say, why is this behavior? And that's where organizational and cultural inertia kick in. The organization is unable to move. Our organization culture is unable to move. The biggest killer here actually is culture. Because you ask yourself, what is culture? What is culture, if you will? Culture, people like to say, and I'm going to skip the organization piece, but I'll talk about the cultural inertia. Culture, in some ways, is about invisible rules. We all create invisible rules for ourselves. So the same thing happens to us individually too, right? We have internal rules. That's the way I am. So for me, the longest time I used to say, no, I don't exercise first thing in the morning. It's just I'm not a morning person for exercise. I like to do my work. I like to think. I like to write. I don't like to exercise. So you know what? I only exercise at the end of the day. And if I'm busy at the end of the day, then I don't exercise. So it was a very convenient out. If I was busy that day, no. It took me a long time to break that rule and say, no, you're going to get up in the morning and you're going to exercise first. Right? So we have these same in organizations. That's not who we are. At Kodak, again, we're a film company. So look at what's happening to us in business schools. For the longest time, we believed learning only happens in the classroom, in our classrooms. And we have built classrooms not only in our campus, but we have a classroom in Mumbai, we have another classroom here and there. We are trying to think we have to have our classroom because case discussion has to happen in a certain way. Well, guess what? No one's coming on campus. So we have to kind of change our own rule set. It's not just strategy, it's also our own internal guidelines. And these guidelines are the killers because they are behavioral obstacles. There is strategic kind of thought obstacles, but then you have these behavioral obstacles, and these really derail companies. Now, and what culture does is it creates a bias for inaction. It creates a It's interesting. We sort of believe that doing nothing is safer than doing something. So, for instance, in times of uncertainty, we don't know what's going to happen. I know everyone wants to know what's going to happen with the pandemic. How quickly are we going to bounce back? How quickly will demand increase? Will this economic crisis come to an end when the vaccine kicks in? We don't know. So the one answer is, well, let's wait. It's safest thing. Let's wait and see. But sometimes waiting and seeing is much more risky than you're missing an opportunity to try something. Another one is bias for habit. Another one is bias for playing defense. Now, as I think about this, and I ask myself, as a leader, what can we think about? So let me bring all this discussion. That was the problem statement. Now let me try to bring it together in my last few minutes around the leadership imperative. You see, if you look at what kind of a mindset it takes to really reimagine and take advantage of adversity, you have to have a mindset of humility, of curiosity, of empathy, and winning. And by empathy, I mean empathy with the customer and your marketplace, and winning. Now, here's what happens. Winning means I'm out there to try to win. What happens is something called, what Lou Gerstner called, the success trap kicks in. Humility turns into arrogance. This turns into a know-it-all. This turns into indifference, and this turns into not losing. And perhaps the last one is the biggest one I want to talk to you about for a minute. You see, what happens is instead of playing to win, which many startups begin with, we have nothing to lose. So you know what? We're going to take risk, of course, with other people's money or our own money, but we're going to try. We're going to roll the dice and try. Somewhere along the way, when we have success, even in small companies, by the way, that's why small companies struggle to pivot. We start to play defense. Let's protect our franchise. Let's hold what we have. And we stop rolling the dice. And this kind of mindset really kicks in. So if we're going to be successful in these dynamic changes time, we have to think about at winning. So we have curiosity, humility, empathy, and winning. Now, if I was to go even deeper into what is one mantra I want to leave you with, thinking about from a leadership perspective, and that is courage. Now, I'll just tell you a short story on courage. So a few years ago, my father passed away. He lived in Delhi and he had a long, good life. And I had to go back and sort out his affairs. And it's a pretty emotional thing because I don't know if any of you had to do this, but as I was sorting through his affairs, I had these flashback stories I remembered from childhood. I don't know, somehow they would come back. And I didn't even remember these stories, or I thought I didn't. So he was in the army, and as I was sorting his uniforms and stuff, I remembered a story from 1971, I think it was. So just after the Bangladesh war, he had come back, and he was part of a unit that had gone in the front lines. So he was in a difficult operation, and anyway, he came back, and I was 10-year-old macho kid. I was very proud of my dad. I said, Dad, when you were out there, were you scared? Now, what is the answer I was looking for? The answer I was hoping he would give me would be the Clint Eastwood answer saying, son, no. And my dad being who he was, he said, son, you have to understand, when you're out in the front lines, you're away from your supply lines, you're really moving forward, not going backward. You're going right at the enemy. So, yeah, it is scary, but, we had a job to do, so we did it. I remember being really disappointed in my dad. I thought, oh my God, my dad was scared. I can't believe it. Now, it's taken me a long time, many decades later, to realize courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is taking action in the face of fear. And I'm not the only one to have said it. Nelson Mandela said it too. So asking ourselves, as we are dealing with what I would say are highly uncertain market conditions ahead, the question to ask ourselves is, am I going to be able to work through my fear to get there? Because, Lou Gerstner used to say this. He said there are four kinds of leaders: those who make things happen, those to whom things happen, those who watch things happen, and those who don't even know things are happening. So as you think about this going forward, I think this is, to me, the real question. Now, I want to end with something that I learned growing up, which is something somebody said thousands of years ago to all of us. We are all familiar with this, so I apologize if you already know this. But I think as we embark into this era of uncertainty, which it will be, if you're looking back and saying we're going to go back to the golden age where everything is known to us, there are too many variables at play. We have too many variables that no one can tell you for sure that, oh my God, we're going to have a bounce back. The vaccine is going to cure everything. And, my God, we're going to be a booming economy and everything else. Nobody can tell you for sure. So what do we have to ask ourselves? We have to ask ourselves, this is what from the Upanishad, you are what your deepest desire is. As your desire is, so is your intention. As your intention is, so is your will. And as your will is, so is your deed. And as your deed is, so is your destiny. So I want to end on that. I'm really delighted to be here and honored to be here to speak to all of you. I'm going to stick around for some questions and I'm going to turn it back to Rishi. Thank you very much.
The suave Professor Ranjay Gulati there on an unprecedented crisis. What should strong leaders be doing? And I tell you this, you guys have certainly been very, very active through this session. Again, multiple centuries being hit as far as the number of questions coming in. But like I said, because of the paucity of time, there are only going to be 3 Mirchi hot questions chosen, curated by our esteemed FMS forum members. And here we go with question number 1. Now, this is from Savita. And question for Professor Gulati: who's better prepared in the face of adversity? Big corporates with deep pockets, or a nimble, small or medium enterprise running on a shoestring budget? Interesting there.
So I wish I could give you a definitive answer and generalize from that. It's a very good question. If I was a betting man, I would tell you the nimble enterprise, because what ends up happening is you may have all the resources, but if you're not willing to course correct, you have to make rapid course correction. In today's uncertain time, what you see is what an ancient navigator used to call point-to-point navigation. Or if you look in chess, when you look at chess grandmasters, they take what is called robust action. Every move is not, they're not planned. Everyone says, 25 moves ahead. What they're looking at is what move will give me the maximum options for the next opportunity. And unfortunately, what happens in large companies is we lock and load. So once you make a move, we're going to de-risk it. We're going to wait till we de-risk it. And you see, so being able to adjust and move. So if I was a betting man, I would take option number 2.
Nice one. Okay, this is Rahul Gosai. Thank you very much, Rahul. And like I said, a 30,000 rupee purse going out, 10,000 rupees each as a Mirchi Hot question. Rahul gets that 10,000 rupee purse. And of course, through the sessions, all the sessions, there's 90,000 rupees going out. Good evening, Professor Gulati. In the current times, where frequent changes have become a part of the business environment, what are important behaviors and attributes which a leader should possess, if you can identify them? And how can a leader actually mobilize change within an organization? Mobilizing it instead of directing it. Interesting.
Yeah. Again, very, very sharp question. I think you answered the question, actually, that great leaders today mobilize and don't authorize action, right? And you have leadership is given to you. You're not bestowed with it because you have a title. Leaders want to follow. And I think that becomes the real question. So how do you build followership is the real question for you to ask. That how do you, now I'm going to share one version of that with you. I've seen some companies where today, increasingly, and you heard about multi-stakeholder capitalism, where you're seeing increasingly leaders talking about having a purpose. And I think that becomes the really important issue that we have to think about. That what do you need to do to really mobilize, others? And I think that is something that I think is an extremely important. Now, you say, are they kind of universals? Of course, there are universals. You can talk about authentic leadership. You can talk about compassionate leadership. You can talk about servant leadership. There are so many frames that are being used to talk about what leadership really does. But more than anything else, it has to also resonate with who you are as a person. You can't fake it. The problem with universals is, everyone tries to force fit themselves into that universal. So there is a personal element to that as well. But you answered the question. Followership, it's about mobilizing, not authorizing.
Okay, we've got one final question curated for Professor Gulati. This is R. Srinivas, Rasabatulla Srinivas. Professor Gulati, in times of crisis, leaders may have to make decisions that are self-sacrificing. For example, a few businessmen in India laid off their staff, but few decided to bear the temporary losses by paying employee salaries. And R. Srinivas asks, my question is, how does one develop the quality of self-sacrifice in leaders?
Yeah.
$1 million question.
First of all, I'm just thinking for a second here, because you ask a really profound question. How do you cultivate this kind of quality? First of all, its importance is given, right? The signaling, again, this guy, Robert Greenleaf, wrote this book on servant leadership so long ago. The idea is, what are you trying to communicate? You're trying to communicate caring and concern. You're trying to communicate that you put the institution before yourself, right? You're trying to communicate to others that you put their well-being ahead of them. What do people want from us as leaders, right? They want to know that you have their concerns at heart as well, and the institutions before yourself. And they're watching you. They're always scrutinizing every action we take, every word we say is really about saying, okay, does this person really mean it? And I think the world has become very cynical. So I think self-sacrificial moves sometimes are the most credible indicator. Speech doesn't mean anything. Actions, of course, are so much more important. So when a leader says, I will be the first in line to take a wage cut, versus I want all of you and I'm going to do this and that and the other. And by the way, don't talk about me. So how do we put ourselves there first? And I think it's a very, very important question. I wish I could tell you that you can cultivate it this is something that has to just come from within. And I want to go back to my point earlier. This whole idea of purpose. Why am I here? What is this? We talk about organizations having a purpose today. This has become huge. Larry Fink and others have written letters about this, that businesses need to articulate a purpose that goes beyond shareholder value. I think we need to interrogate that question for ourselves as leaders. Why am I here? Why have I been put in this place? And what opportunities does this give me to make a difference in other people's lives? At HBS, our purpose statement is, we educate leaders who make a difference in the world. I think everyone should ask themselves individually that question and collectively that question. And I think then the answer will reveal itself easily to us.
It's very, very beautifully put. Thank you so much, Professor Gulati, for your remarkable words and, being so liberal with your time and your energy. And look forward to seeing you very, very soon.
Thank you. All the very best. Thanks
Ladies
so much,
and gentlemen.
And all the very best to everybody. Happy holidays, safe holidays, and a very happy new year to all of you.